There's a wave across the land. We are moving, moving. It takes one step, it takes your voice, saying, I am not hearing if you are not naming it. I am not stopping if you are not changing it. Here are my hands, let's see what they're making. In the morning, in the rise up, there's a bridge from all that's been in the dawning. The vines are pushing through the pavement. We were born of burning hearts. We are tearing off the reins. From the ground up we will build it. From the clouds above we'll rain it. From the crowd up we will raise it. From the ground up.
I'm Nisha Moodley, and this is Devotion, the podcast about showing up in new ways to weave a new world together. Hello, beautiful beings. Welcome back to Devotion Podcast. Today, I want to share a story with you that I'm inspired to share after episode 3, where I talked about showing up amidst grief and heartbreak. And one of the biggest moments of grief, moments of heartbreak, experiences of grief and heartbreak in my life has been, to date, journeying with my father through his final days, weeks, and years of his life. And, actually, we had a grief and heartbreak-filled relationship while he was alive in many ways. And so, while there's been the grief of his death to process, I've processed a lot of grief around my relationship with my father in my life, and likely have more to process as well, although I have a very different experience of my relationship with him now after his death than I did at any point during his life. And I really questioned whether or not to share this story with you. After episode 3, I shared a bit about a little snippet on Instagram about a story from his death and asked, would anybody want to hear this story? And I had a really big response. A lot of people sharing, yes, please, I would love to hear this story. We need more stories like this. And so in part, it was inspired by that response that I received, but it's a tricky time to be talking about death. Maybe it always is, but we are in COVID times right now. A lot of people are dying deaths that perhaps they didn't imagine would be their deaths. And a lot of people are saying goodbye to loved ones in less intimate or less physically close ways than they would want to. And my heart really goes out to folks for whom death is near in either of these ways, and who are not having the experience of death and of saying goodbye that they might want. So if you're in that position, I send you my love, and if you need to not listen to this story as a way to take care of yourself, please go ahead and skip this one. And the reason that I'm sharing in this time is that I do believe we need more stories of intimate, beautiful, redemptive deaths. And this doesn't have to be a story that everyone listens to. So I'll leave that to you to know if this is your time to listen to a story of death or not. And another reason why I really questioned whether or not to share this story is that there is a really big narrative that I've experienced in my life anyways around only speaking highly of people who have passed. And the reality is humans are complex. None of us is all good or all bad. And I'm not saying we always have to dig for the redemptive qualities inside of, people who have caused a lot of harm, or that we have to dig for negative qualities with people who have been mostly gracious and grace-filled in their lives, but just that we're complex. And I think we often erase histories and gaslight people's experiences by not allowing for that complexity. So I want to share this story, even though it's hard, even though there are beautiful aspects of it and also really difficult aspects of it. So thank you in advance for listening. I think that it's nourishing at times to have ourselves witnessed in our stories. And really, I also am sharing this not just for myself, but because I hope that in hearing this story, it might inspire you to consider how you want to do death with your loved ones and even for yourself. So I don't feel I can tell really the story of my father's death without sharing a little bit about my relationship with him, because we didn't come to this intimate, beautiful, redemptive death journey together easily. It wasn't an obvious sort of natural extension of an intimate, beautiful relationship. My parents divorced when I was 3 years old. And what I remember is going to a therapist a couple times a week, a court-appointed therapist. And this therapist was trying to get to the decision about which parent I would live with or where I would live, what the custody configuration would be. And I remember drawing and painting and having conversations with this therapist. Again, I was 3 years old. And I remember at the end of every session, this therapist would ask me where I wanted to live. And this is my recollection. It maybe wasn't every session. So in fairness, I understand that, I was 3 years old. So I don't have perfect memory, of course, of the experience. But my recollection is being asked at least very often where I wanted to live. And I would sort of frustratedly explain again, I want to live with my mommy and my daddy. And finally, after many, many sessions, I don't know how many, there was a table when I came in one day and it had flashcards on it. And the table was sort of eye height for me. So when I was standing, I could maybe just sort of see the top of the table. And it was covered in flashcards, and every card had a different option on it. So live with mom full-time, never see dad. Live with dad full-time, never see mom. Live with mom and see dad on holidays. Live with dad and see mom on alternate holidays. All of these options. And I remember in my 3-year-old mind strategizing for two things. One, that I be away from my mom for the shortest amount of time possible, because I couldn't imagine being away from her really. And two, choosing something fair, in that case meaning equal. And so what we ended up with was 1 week with mom and 1 week with dad. And this is a whole other conversation, but I remember in that moment really surrendering, but in this sort of collapse sense, surrendering to the idea that what I wanted really didn't matter. And it was up to me to make a decision that would be best for everyone. So that, we could get into the psychology of that and all of the implications of that throughout my life. But, I came into this period of going back and forth between my parents, not because it was necessarily the best thing for me or the thing that I most wanted, but because I sort of believed that's what I had to do, and the courts were involved, and it was that's just how it shook out. So I lived with my father every opposite week, and my mom was a single mom when I was with her. My dad was a single dad. My mom did meet my stepdad when I was quite young, so she had some support in that way for sure. And I also spent time with my extended family when I was with my dad as well. But being alone with my dad was often really difficult. I experienced my dad to be very sensitive, to be very close to rage, and he struggled with alcohol throughout my life. And so my experience of being with my dad, even as an adult, was often that I was sort of in this frozen little girl state where I was trying to walk on eggshells, to not say something that might upset him, and to be pleasable and peacekeeping, and also to kind of get it over with. Okay, we're going to hang out. Let's just hang out and see when it would be over. And I don't mean to imply that my dad was a monster or anything like that, but we had a very difficult relationship, and I, didn't ever in his life fully, until the very end, shake this very little girl way of being in his presence as much as I tried. It changed as I became a mother, but it was very hard to be fully sovereign in my own energy and adult-like with him. So a few years before my father died, I received a phone call letting me know that he wasn't doing well. And that was basically the beginning of reckoning with my father's death in a deeper way. My father's decline was mainly due to alcohol, and his body was shutting down. And his body was shutting down, his mind was compromised, and my dad was whip smart. He was whip smart, very well read, and an incredible dot connector, pattern recognizer. But as his mind started to go, because of the toxicity in his body, because of the alcohol, he made patterns or tracked patterns that weren't necessarily there. It was really difficult to deal with because he would say things with certainty and clarity and sometimes with aggression, like an aggressive force. And at times I didn't know if they were true or not. And then sometimes he was very obviously kind of out of it. And it was like that for a couple of years on and off. He would have periods where it seemed like he was doing great. And then I would get a phone call from the hospital saying, "What time are you coming to pick your dad up?" And I would say, "I'm sorry, I don't understand the question." And they would say, "Well, he's dressed and he's got his backpack on, and we were just wondering what time you were arriving." And I would say, "I am in California." And my dad was in Canada. "I'm not coming today to pick him up. I don't even have plans to visit yet." So there was a lot of up and down in those final few years for him. And he went from living in a hospital to living in a long-term care facility, basically a nursing home, where he was definitely one of the youngest people there. And that was really hard for me to reckon with. It was really hard for me to see. And again, it was really up and down. We had times where he just seemed like, gosh, this guy's going to live forever, for at least another 5 or 10 years, the way that it seems. And then other times where he didn't know what year it was. I have a lot of stories about that, but I won't go into all of them. And what happened, though, over time with all of these ups and downs is it was hard to know how close we really were to the end, right? We would have a doctor say, well, I think realistically he has a few months left, and then a year would pass, right? And we'd get a call that he really wasn't doing well. And then I would go and see him, and he would sort of perk up, and he'd be doing really great for a while. And then there would be a decline again. And all throughout this time, my aunt and I, in the beginning, fought really hard to have him protected under the Mental Health Act, because there was a lot of up and down. And that basically afforded us the opportunity to have a power of attorney. And that meant that I became responsible immediately for making all of the big decisions, really, for my dad. I had to make all of his bill payments, and every time that there was a medical decision, or even that he needed to see the dentist or wanted to buy something from a pharmacy, I would make that decision. And we found ways to make it a little less intense over time, with spending limits. And I hired someone who could come and pick him up and take him to run errands every couple weeks. But it was a lot to have a, 1-year-old, then 2-year-old at home, and also be running my business and my household and managing my dad's affairs. During that time, while he was alive, I sold his house, and that was a really big process because he hadn't been living in the most nourishing of ways, we can say, in the last several years of his life. And so it was very sad to go through his belongings and to envision his life in that way. There was a lot of grief in that process for me. And I'm also really relieved and grateful that we were able to do that while he was alive. I think it would have been really hard to have to make all of those decisions. And I've spoken with people who had to go through a similar process after their loved one died, when they're just, hit by waves of grief. And so I'm grateful for that opportunity that I had to do all of that. So there are all these ups and downs, and a lot of work, a lot of time going into attending to all of these details. And sometimes I was on top of it. Sometimes I really wasn't on top of it. And, so there was also this kind of accruing amount of work and accruing guilt, and, guilt for not being there. He really seemed to perk up and do much better when I was there, when I brought Raven around, and then I would leave again to come back to California and my life. And it seemed like his spirits tended in some ways to go with me, how close I was, how close my child was. And I felt a lot of guilt around that. And it was really hard to live my life and know that my lack of presence there was impacting him, but also this is where I live. And it was a lot to reckon with. So after a lot of ups and downs, I was in Bali hosting retreats last September, October. And I got a call from the nurse, my dad's favorite nurse. And she said, okay, he's really not doing well this time. So we think he's might be nearing the end. And I think you should come back if you want to and say goodbye. So we did a lot of juggling and adjusting, and flew back to go see my dad. And it's hard to remember now, even though it was less than a year ago, but I think what ended up happening is we got there and he really perked up. And so it wasn't really a goodbye. And we ended up coming back to California after a week or so. And I did a lot of crying, like, okay, that might be the last time I see him. But again, he had kind of perked up. He was well for those days. And it was like everybody was kind of scratching their heads like, well, actually he's doing much better. And I don't know, maybe false alarm, right? And so we came back to California, and within a couple of weeks, I got another call. And it really, they said, we really think now that this is, the end. We don't see him coming back from this. So it was a really difficult time. Noah was about to go in for a major surgery a week later, which meant that we had to be here for that surgery. It had been rescheduled a few times. And so that was, a factor. And I would be watching Raven by myself. We didn't have any family around. We have Noah's brother, but no other family to watch the kid and help out when we're going through stuff like that. And so we went like, okay, do we go back? And I thought, yeah, this is my chance to maybe actually say goodbye. So we traveled back, and I spent the next 3 nights with my dad. I slept in the room beside him in a sort of reclining chair. And when I arrived, I built an altar in his room. I had brought some things that were special to our family. I had my cousin bring some things as well, and we built an altar, and I just sat with him bedside. And it was a really amazing journey. The first day that I was there with him, I just had these flashes all day of memories from my life, especially my childhood with him. These flashes of intense anger, intense hurt, feelings of abandonment and betrayal and heartbreak. And as much as I wanted to be present with him, and, by the time I got there, my dad was not really verbal. And as much as I wanted to be with him in this really sweet way, that whole first day, I just felt so heartbroken, so angry, and all of these memories. And because my dad was so incapacitated, it was the first time I think that I ever really let myself feel those feelings fully in his presence. And cried. I cried in his presence. I cried about my anger. I cried about my hurt. And just let myself feel all of that in front of him, or at least as much as I was able to feel at the time. And so that first day was really hard with all of those memories and sort of flashbacks. And then the second day, all I had was these memories. And some were things that I don't even remember. And, I don't know, and maybe I'll never know if they actually happened or if I was remembering them for the first time. But I had all of these flashes, these memories of just moments of such sweetness and joy and play and, times that my dad was so tender and sweet with me. And I wept that day with those memories and was much more affectionate with him and sweet with him, and really felt that other texture of grief that was not my anger, my rage, my hurt, but my deep sadness that I was losing my dad and that we weren't going to make any more of those memories together. And then the third day, which was his last full day of life, I just felt his essence. And when I say that, what I mean was, like, I had these flashes, and of course they couldn't have been memories in the way that we think of memories anyways from my life, because I had these flashes of him as a child and seeing him playing. And it was this innocence, the innocence of a child, bright eyes, curiosity, playfulness, things that I saw glimmers of in my dad, and certainly saw those qualities come out in him in moments. And then often in moments they were obscured by his stress, his pain, his anger. But that whole day, it was like I was connecting with his childlike spirit, his essence. And it was so sweet to know my dad in that way. It was like these things that I saw in him, but never felt like I really knew in him, if that makes sense. And that day I had the opportunity to know that in him. And it's interesting because when I think of my dad now, I feel a lot of that. I feel a lot of that childlike, curious, playful, kind of impish quality in him. And, I'll share a little bit about the final moments, but first, a few things that I learned in those days. One, it was really challenging, especially in the beginning, like the first day or even two, to not rush the death, but also to not slow it down, to just let it unfold. It was a real surrender for me, a real journey of surrender. And there was something about being with him, sleeping beside him, listening to his breathing, cleaning his mouth, that I felt very in tune with him, taking care of him in that way and being so close to him in that way. And maybe that surrender came from being more in tune, that there was nothing to rush and there was nothing to slow down, that it could just unfold, that it could just happen. It was also really beautiful to have Raven around and not have him around like he was at a funeral or in a china shop, like silent in the corner, but to have him playing, running around and playing and just being, at the time, a 2-year-old, just being a 2-year-old, and to have him see my dad that way and to talk to him about it, to say, Grandpa Coco is dying, and to see if he had feelings about that or questions about it, but to not avoid that. And I'm not saying that that's right for every child or every person, adult, to choose that for their child, but it was really powerful for us as a family. It was really, that's what felt true for me as his mother, to let him play, to let him be there in the space, and to let him see my dad that way. And to notice where I wanted to be really precious about his experience in a way, to protect him from seeing my dad that way, rather than, well, this is life. Like, this is a part of life, is being born and dying. And, when I didn't feel like I could, if I didn't feel like I could parent him, I made sure that I wasn't alone with him, so that he had a stable adult to hold him. And, when I was there almost the entire 3 days. I left a couple of times. I went out for brunch with my aunts and my cousins. and went out, I think, once or twice in addition to that. But the other times, Raven and Noah came there. And so they saw my dad once a day. They came through in those last 3 days. And another thing that was really powerful was on the night before my dad died, his sister came and I remember just inviting her to say whatever was on her heart in front of my dad. And I really believe in many ways that we try to give people the death that they want, or that they, when they were alive, might have wanted, that their ego might have wanted. And in that moment, I just really had this sense like, this is also about us. This is also about, like, it's his death, but also it's my father, me losing my father, or losing, maybe not losing, but me saying goodbye to my father and his sister saying goodbye to her brother. And the death obviously impacts the dying, but it also impacts their beloveds. And really for us to do our processing and have our experience and say what we need to say, it was really profound. So the night before my dad passed away, we listened to a lot of our favorite music. We talked about music a lot. It was something that my dad and I could connect around. We loved a lot of the same music, and we talked about music a lot. And when I say we talked, it was me talking and him, trying to nod, him responding. Mostly I couldn't understand, but I remember saying to him at some point, Sade is the best. And he nodded and went like, basically saying yes. And it sounds too wild to be real, but I remember playing the song Kiss of Life by Sade, and a tear went down my dad's cheek. And I don't know if his eyes were just watery or if it was a tear from him crying, but it felt beautiful and tender and really precious. So that night before he died, we listened to some of our favorite music, and I took the time to tell him all of my favorite qualities in myself that I feel like I got from him. And I thanked him for my life. And the last thing that my dad said before he died, he said, in a very mumbled way, Nisha, I love you. It didn't sound like that, but it was discernible, barely. And what a gift. Such a gift. So I slept beside my father that final night. And the next day, of course, I didn't know it was the final night. Every night that I was falling asleep beside him, I thought maybe I'll wake up and he'll be gone, or who knows. But I was pretty surrendered at that point to this journey. So I woke up the next morning. It was November 29th. And for the first time in days, I felt the urge to take a shower and put on fresh clothes that I hadn't worn. And so I did. I got up, I had a shower, I put on new clothes. I came into his room while I had that shower. I played more Sade for him. And I came back in the room, and for the first time again in days, I felt to open the curtains. So it was just this very, following my instincts. I opened the curtains for the first time, and his head was turned towards the window. So he was kind of looking out the window, you might say. I don't know how much he was seeing at that point, but his face was turned towards the window, and he had an African violet, which was his favorite, on the windowsill that hadn't been watered in a long time. I didn't see it until I opened the curtains. So I took all of the dead leaves off of the violet and I watered it, which in retrospect felt really poetic. And shortly after that, Noah and Raven and my cousin Marielle and her baby, Weston, came for a visit. And we spent a little time with my dad. And then I turned the music off again, just intuitively, instinctively. And we went out into the hallway in the nursing home and went and sat down. They had brought breakfast for me, and we sat down and had some food together. And there was a little patio at the nursing home, and they let Raven go out on the patio and pick some cherry tomatoes. And so we came back in to the room, and Raven came in and he handed me a little cherry tomato and he said, "This is for Grandpa Coco." And at that point, my dad had a mala, like a mala necklace, mala beads, prayer beads on his chest that belonged to the father of my cousin's husband. So my cousin-in-law, his father, who had passed away a few years prior. And so I put the cherry tomato with these prayer beads on my dad's chest. And when we had come back, my dad's breathing had changed significantly. So while we had left him with the curtains open and the music off, and he had some time by himself, some of the only time that he had had by himself, he really transitioned much more deeply into his death. And so we came back and his breathing had slowed quite significantly. And my cousin started playing Ravi Shankar on her phone. And she was nursing her baby. And I was sitting beside my dad and leaning my head on his shoulder, and my cousin was nursing her baby, and there was Ravi Shankar playing in the background, and she was talking to my dad, and she was telling him stories from our childhood. And I'm very close with my cousin, so she was telling him all of these stories of, tricks he used to play on us, and times that we would go for meals at our Aya's house, our grandmother's house. And his breathing was slowing down, and Raven had climbed into the chair with me as I had my head on my dad's pillow right beside him. And at some point, my cousin just sort of naturally stopped speaking, and she was still nursing. And I just said in my dad's ear, "Thank you, Dad. I love you. We're all going to be okay. And it's safe for you to go." And he took his last breath. And in the moment that he took his last breath, my nephew, Weston, unlatched. He had been nursing. He unlatched and looked right at my dad. And Raven jumped down from the chair and kind of started running around. So, of course, we're like, shh, 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 not realizing or being sure if it was his last breath because, the last few breaths are very irregular. So all the adults kind of stood just staring at my dad, which kind of seems funny in retrospect. But my cousin went to go check to get the nurse to do a check on my dad. And Noah took the kids outside to let them run around. And I was alone in the room with my dad, really getting that had been his last breath. And I closed my eyes and I just spoke from my heart. And I said his name 3 times, Coghlan Moodley, Coghlan Moodley, Coghlan Moodley. And I called on our ancestors and I called on my grandparents to come and claim him and take him home and to wrap him in love and help him on his journey. And I remember saying, may this moment be healing for our family, for this generation, and for all generations to come. And I sang a Hindu prayer and told my dad that I loved him. And then my cousin returned with the nurse, and the nurse listened to his pulse, and she welled up with tears. And of course, it was his favorite nurse. And she nodded, and said, he's gone. And she said some really sweet words to my dad, directly to him, thanking him and telling him how loved he was by his girls, me and my cousin. And myself and my cousin and the nurse kind of all held hands together and cried together. And then the care workers at the hospital or the nursing home came and undressed him and took away the pillows and put a fresh sheet. And my cousin and I washed my dad's body, and I anointed him with some sandalwood oil. And we wrapped him up and placed some ash on his forehead first and wrapped him up. And we hugged and prayed together for a little while, and then we called our family. And it was beautiful. It was really beautiful. It was not something that I could have designed. The only part of it that I really prepared for was just Googling how folks in our culture take care of a body after death, which is why we had washed him and placed ash on him and wrapped him. But everything else was really a surrender to the moment and a surrender to his dance with death, his journey. I really believe that because I was able to be in that dance with him, and, again, it was precious that I was able to be there in person. And if I wasn't, in hindsight, if I wasn't able in the future to be with a loved one in person, I think as much as I could commune with them in spirit throughout their passing and after, and bring in these elements of ritual and prayer or whatever resonates, music. I would do that in the future because it was really important for me in my dance with grief to have been able to weave in those elements. So my father passed, Coghlan Moodley, on November 20th. Sorry, that's not true. November 29th, 2019. And he passed away 4 years after I had met Noah on my dad's birthday. I say this because there were a lot of fours involved in my dad's death. In numerology, the day he died was a 4 day, and he died 4 years after I had met Noah on his birthday. And he died, my parents divorced when I was very young, but my father died on what would have been my parents' 44th wedding anniversary. So there was so much poetry to the experience, and for someone who I think the last several years of his life were very difficult, it felt really beautiful for him to have a beautiful end. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share it, and my deep wish, my deep prayer in sharing this is that we normalize death a little more and explore the ways that we want to do death. I know I said this at the beginning, but I just want to reiterate it again, that there are so many ways that we can do death for ourselves, for our loved ones, and it was really empowering for me and for my family, and I hope for my father as well, that we were able to do it our way, his way, but also our way. So thank you again for listening, and I wish you so much love and blessings. Hey everyone, before we head out today, I have an invitation that I'm really excited to bring to you. So if you've been feeling the intensity of these times, but you're also feeling your own devotion to showing up in your own unique ways with your own unique gifts, now and always, I have a free workshop coming up called Embody Your Leadership. So in this workshop, we're going to connect as a community who is devoted to giving our unique gifts in service of a more liberatory and regenerative future while showing up in nourishing ways, which means we're devoted to showing up in ways that don't burn us out, that don't kill our relationships, and that allow for pleasure in our lives. And to show up in all the ways that really matter for us, for our world, for the collective. And in the workshop, we're going to discover your own personal North Star, which is one of my favorite ways to connect with a very rooted inspiration at any moment and give me access to deeper clarity, deeper focus, and more resilience, even and especially when things feel hard. You know, as a mom, when I have had a long night or a pretty sleepless night, or when my kid and I are going through something, or when work is just feeling difficult or the world is feeling super intense. You know, this North Star for me is the thing that keeps me or allows me to come back to feeling really grounded and clear and focused. I'm also going to share some of my favorite tools for working with anxiety and overwhelm, and that especially in those times where I'm stepping up in bigger ways, right? Using my voice in a bigger way or working on new projects like this podcast, or when the fear of doing it wrong, making a mistake, messing up feels especially intense. We'll also have an opportunity to identify some of the bigger hangups that are preventing you from seeing and honoring and giving your gifts fully. And we all have these hangups. So we're going to talk about them, and we're also going to talk about what to do about them. So you can sign up for this workshop for free at embodyyourleadership.com. And I just want to say that I know it can feel really hard to feel rooted and hopeful when our livelihoods and our social structures feel tenuous and the world feels like it's burning. And yet I deeply believe that we are here, so we must be made for these times, and that it'll take each of our unique leadership to co-create the world that we dream of. So I hope you'll join us at embodyyourleadership.com. Thanks. Thank you so much for being here, beloved. I want to extend my heartfelt invitation for you to join our podcast Inner Circle for free at devotionpodcast.com. You'll receive access to show notes and free bonuses, including my favorite guided meditation when you sign up. If you loved this episode, please share it, subscribe, and I'd be so grateful if you would leave a review. Our mixing and sound design is by Lou Janot, brand design by Neverland Studio, episode images by Liv Haddon, and our theme song is From the Ground Up by Ayla Nerio. Thank you all, and thank you so much for being here. I'm so grateful, and I'll talk to you soon.
We were born up in a clouds above, we're raining. From the crowd up, we were rising. From the ground up, we were building. From the clouds above, we're raining. From the crowd up, we will raise it. From the ground up.